At Christmas dinner, my mom smirked. "We finally sold Grandma's house, you were never in the will anyway." My sister laughed. "Good, she'd just waste it." I took a sip of wine and said, "Cool. Hope you enjoy the cash. Since I'm the one who bought it." The table went silent. The dining room smelled like rosemary and roasted turkey, but all I could taste was the bitterness coating my tongue as my mother's words hung in the air. Christmas lights twinkled outside the frost-covered windows while inside, the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. "We finally sold Grandma's house," Mom announced, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes. "You were never in the will anyway." My sister Victoria let out this high-pitched laugh that grated against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. "Good. She just wasted on whatever ridiculous hobby she's into this month." I set down my fork carefully, fighting the urge to let my hands shake. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for since August, when I'd first heard through Aunt Paula that they were planning to sell Grandma Dorothy's Victorian house on Maple Street. The home where I'd spend every summer of my childhood, learning to bake lemon cookies in her sunny kitchen and listening to her stories on the wraparound porch. Dad kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his turkey into smaller and smaller pieces. He'd perfected the art of disappearing without leaving the room years ago. I reached for my wine glass, took a slow sip of the Merlot, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Cool. Hope you enjoy the cash, since I'm the one who bought it." The table went silent. Mom's fork clattered against her china plate. Victoria's mouth fell open mid-chew, a piece of stuffing visible on her tongue. Even Dad looked up, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "What did you just say?" Mom's voice came out strangled, barely above a whisper. I smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I said I bought it. Through an LLC, actually. Sterling Properties Management. The paperwork went through last week." Victoria recovered first, always quicker to anger than shock. "You're lying. That's impossible. We got $275,000 for that house." "285,000, actually," I corrected, taking another sip of wine. "I overbid by $10,000 to make sure you'd accept. The realtor said you were motivated sellers." Mom's face had gone from red to white, a vein pulsing at her temple. "This is some kind of sick joke." "No joke. I can show you the closing documents if you'd like. They're on my phone." I pulled out my iPhone, scrolling through my email with deliberate slowness. "Here we are. Signed, sealed, and delivered 3 days ago. December 22nd, to be exact." The betrayal in Mom's eyes would have hurt if I hadn't spent the last 15 years building calluses over every wound she'd inflicted. This was the woman who told me I was wasting my life when I chose to become a freelance graphic designer instead of following Victoria into corporate law. The same woman who'd forgotten my 30th birthday but threw Victoria a surprise party for her 28th that cost more than my car. My mind flashed back to that birthday. I'd waited all day for a call, a text, anything. I'd even baked myself a small cake, pathetic as it sounds, sitting alone in my studio apartment with a single candle. When Mom finally called 3 days later, she didn't apologize. She'd been busy planning Victoria's party, she said, as if that explained everything. As if I should understand that my sister's celebration 2 months away took precedence over acknowledging my existence on the actual day I was born. I remembered Victoria's party with painful clarity. The rented ballroom, the champagne fountain, the ice sculpture shaped like the scales of justice because of course it was. Mom had given a toast about how proud she was of her successful daughter, the lawyer, the one who'd made something of herself. I'd stood in the corner nursing a vodka tonic, invisible in a room full of people who barely knew I existed. "You could have worked harder," Mom had told me once, after I'd complained about the favoritism. Victoria earned her success. She went to law school, she put in the hours, she made the right choices. You chose to draw pictures for a living. Draw pictures. As if the branding campaign I'd created for a Fortune 500 company was equivalent to doodling in a coloring book. As if the 30-hour weeks I'd spent perfecting a single logo design were somehow less valid than Victoria's billable hours defending corporate interests. "How did you even afford it?" Victoria demanded, her lawyer voice coming out in full force. "You work from home doing little art projects. Those little art projects pay quite well, actually. Turns out major corporations need branding, and they're willing to pay 6 figures for someone who knows what they're doing." I stabbed a green bean with more force than necessary. "I've been saving for 7 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner where you reminded me I wasn't good enough." It added up. The truth was more complicated than that simple explanation. Yes, I'd been saving, but the real money had come from a risk I'd taken 2 years ago. A startup had approached me about becoming their creative director, offering equity instead of a higher salary. Mom had laughed when I told her, said I was being scammed. Victoria had sent me a condescending email about the importance of steady paychecks and 401k contributions. The startup had gone public 18 months ago. My equity had been worth just over $400,000 when I'd sold it. After capital gains taxes took their bite, about $70,000, I cleared $330,000. I kept that information to myself, watching my family continue to treat me like a struggling artist barely making rent. Let them underestimate me. It made moments like this so much sweeter. I'd also been ruthlessly frugal in ways they'd never understand. While Victoria was buying her third designer handbag, I was meal prepping and shopping at thrift stores. While Mom was redecorating her living room for the fourth time in 5 years, I was driving the same Honda Civic I'd bought used in college. Every dollar saved was a dollar toward freedom, toward reclaiming what was mine. The financial advisor I'd started seeing after the equity sale had been skeptical when I told him my plan. Real estate is a big commitment, he'd said, reviewing my portfolio. Are you sure you want to tie up this much capital in a single property? You'll need to keep at least $50,000 liquid for renovations and emergencies. I'd shown him pictures of Grandma's house, explained what it meant to me. He'd softened then, nodded with understanding. Sometimes it's not just about the numbers, he'd admitted. Sometimes it's about what you can't put a price on. He'd helped me structure everything properly. The LLC had been established 6 months before I'd even heard about the potential sale, originally intended as a vehicle for purchasing rental properties. When Aunt Paula had tipped me off in August, everything was already in place. I just had to move fast. But I could put a price on it. $285,000, to be exact. The number had seemed astronomical when I'd first seen the listing, but I'd known immediately I would pay it. I would have paid more if necessary. This wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about justice. The closing had been rushed but legal. Mom and Victoria had been eager to sell, and my all-cash offer with a 30-day close had been irresistible. The realtor had pushed the paperwork through in 3 weeks, and by mid-December, the house was mine. Dad finally found his voice. Sweetheart, I don't understand. Why would you do this? Why? I set down my wine glass hard enough that the stem nearly cracked. Because Grandma Dorothy promised me the house. When I was 16 years old, sitting on that porch after you all forgot to pick me up from band practice, she told me it would be mine someday. She said I was the only one who loved it the way she did. I could still see that afternoon with perfect clarity. The sun had been setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that I'd later try to recreate in a dozen different design projects. I'd waited at the school for 2 hours, watching other kids get picked up one by one, until finally I'd walked the 3 miles to Grandma's house because I didn't know where else to go. She found me crying on her porch steps, mascara running down my face, my clarinet case clutched in trembling hands. She hadn't asked questions, hadn't made me explain. She just wrapped me in one of her hand-knitted shawls and brought me lemonade in the tall glasses with the painted flowers. They forgot, I'd finally managed to say. They just forgot I existed. Grandma had stroked my hair, her fingers gentle and sure. Some people get so caught up in their own lives, they can't see what's right in front of them. Your mother, she's always been that way. Even as a little girl, she only saw what she wanted to see. We'd sat together as the sky darkened, and she told me stories about the house. How she'd saved for 10 years to buy it, hiding money from my grandfather who thought wives shouldn't have their own bank accounts. How she'd signed the deed in her name only, her first real act of rebellion in a marriage that had lasted 43 years. This house is mine, she'd said firmly. Not his, not ours. Mine. And someday, it'll be yours. You understand it, sweetheart. You see it as a home, not just walls and a roof. You'll take care of it the way it deserves. I'd believed her completely. Why wouldn't I? Grandma never lied to me, never made promises she didn't intend to keep. She was the one constant in a family that treated me like an afterthought, the proof that someone could love me without conditions or expectations. The band practice incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a pattern that had defined my entire childhood. The school play where I had the lead role and nobody came to watch. The art show where my painting won first place and Mom complained about having to drive across town. The college graduation where they showed up an hour late because Victoria had needed help moving into her new apartment. Each time, Grandma had been there. She'd come to every play, every art show, every moment that mattered. She'd taken photos and kept scrapbooks, saving programs and ribbons like they were treasures. Her house had been full of my artwork, my achievements, the evidence that I existed and mattered. And they tried to sell it all like it meant nothing. Mom scoffed. She was senile at the end. You can't hold her to ramblings from years ago. She wasn't senile when she told me. She wasn't senile when she revised her will in 2019, either. I found a copy of it in her desk when I was helping clean out the attic. I met Mom's gaze directly. The one where she left the house to me, dated March 15, 2019. Signed by her, witnessed by her attorney, and notarized. The color drained from Mom's face completely now. But that will mysteriously disappeared after her funeral, didn't it? I continued, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. And suddenly there was this older version from 2012 that left everything split between you and Aunt Paula, with nothing specific about the house. Finding that will had been the catalyst for everything. I'd been in Grandma's attic on a sweltering July afternoon, sorting through boxes of old clothes and books that Mom had deemed worthless. Victoria hadn't even bothered to show up, claiming she had a deposition to prepare for. Mom had stayed downstairs, directing the estate sale workers with the efficiency of a general commanding troops. I'd found the will tucked inside a photo album, pressed between pages of pictures from my childhood. Me and Grandma in her garden. Me and Grandma baking cookies. Me and Grandma on the porch swing, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. The document had been crisp and official, the lawyer's letterhead embossed at the top. I'd read it 3 times, my hands shaking harder with each pass. The house was mine. Grandma had put it in writing, made it legal and binding. Everything else went to Mom and Aunt Paula, but the house, the heart of everything, belonged to me. I'd taken photos of every page with my phone before carefully returning it to the album. Then I kept sorting through boxes, my mind racing with implications. If this will existed, why were we operating under an older one? Where was the original copy that should have been with Grandma's attorney? The answers had come slowly, piece by piece, like solving a puzzle where someone had hidden half the pieces. Mr. Hammond, Grandma's lawyer, had retired just weeks after her death in late April 2023. Convenient timing, though perhaps coincidental. His replacement at the firm had no record of any will dated 2019, only the 2012 version that Mom had produced. I'd spent weeks trying to reach Mr. Hammond, leaving messages at the retirement community where he'd moved. When he finally called back in early May, his voice had been careful, measured in the way of someone who'd spent 50 years navigating legal minefields. "I can't discuss specific client matters," he'd said. "But I will tell you this, your grandmother was one of the sharpest women I ever knew. She kept copies of important documents in multiple locations. If something existed, she would have made sure it could be found by the right person. I filed the will I had on record with the probate court, as legally required. If there were other documents, I never received them in my office files." His words had been carefully chosen. He'd filed what he had, the 2012 will, because that's what was in his official records. But he was telling me that Grandma had kept other copies elsewhere, copies that might tell a different story. The implication was clear, someone had made sure the 2019 will never reached his office. That conversation had sent me back to the house with new determination. I'd searched every room, every drawer, every possible hiding place. The cameras had been Mom's idea, installed after a break-in attempt in early 2023, Grandma's final year. But Grandma had been the one to choose their locations, and she'd been clever about it. The footage from the main system showed exactly what I told them, Mom and Victoria in the study on April 28, 2023, 4 days after Grandma's funeral, papers disappearing into bags. But it wasn't enough to prove theft, not legally. They could claim they were just collecting documents for the estate, organizing Grandma's affairs. The backup system was different. Grandma had mentioned it once, cryptically, during one of our last conversations before she'd gotten too sick to talk much. "I've taken precautions," she'd said, her voice raspy from the pneumonia that would eventually take her. "Made sure the truth can't be buried. Look for the birds, sweetheart. Always look for the birds." I thought she was confused, the medication making her ramble. But later, going through her things, I'd found the bird paintings she'd collected over the years. Ordinary artwork, the kind you'd see at any craft fair. Except one of them, a blue jay on a branch, had seemed slightly crooked. Behind it, I'd found the second camera, so small it could fit on a quarter. And its footage showed everything, Mom finding the 2019 will, reading it aloud to Victoria with growing fury. Victoria suggesting they destroy it. Mom's hesitation, then her agreement. The will being fed into Grandma's paper shredder, page by page, until nothing remained but confetti. I backed up that footage to 3 different cloud services, and a physical hard drive locked in a safe deposit box. Insurance, in case they tried to challenge the sale or come after me legally. I had proof of their crime, even if I had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. Destroying a will wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. It was fraud, theft, potentially multiple felonies depending on how the prosecutor wanted to charge it. But prosecution would destroy Dad, would make everything public in ways that couldn't be undone. It would also mean admitting I'd known about the 2019 will and watched them commit a crime without reporting it immediately. The statute of limitations gave me time to decide, but using this evidence would burn everything down. Better to keep it as leverage, as the sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. They didn't know exactly what I had, but they knew I had something. The fear in their eyes told me that was enough. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "You have no proof of any of this." "Actually, I have a copy. Grandma's attorney, Mr. Hammond, kept one in his files. He retired last year, but before he did, he sent me a letter suggesting I might want to look into things. He couldn't say much for legal reasons, but he made it clear something wasn't right." I pulled up another document on my phone. I also have the security footage from the house that Grandma had installed in 2020. You know, the system she got after someone tried to break in? The footage from April 2023 is particularly interesting. Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I won't sit here and be accused of theft by my own daughter." "Then leave." The words came out colder than I intended, but I didn't take them back. "This is technically my house now anyway. Dad can stay, but you and Victoria should probably go." "This isn't your house," Victoria hissed. "This is our childhood home?" "No, this is Dad's house. The one he's been paying the mortgage on for 32 years. I turned to my father, who looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Dad, I need to know. Did you know what they did? He shook his head slowly, and I believed him. Dad had spent his whole marriage being steamrolled by Mom's ambitions and Victoria's demands. He was a good man who'd taken the path of least resistance so many times he'd worn a groove into his own soul. I didn't know about any other will, he said quietly. Your mother handled all the estate paperwork after Dorothy passed. Mom grabbed her purse from the back of her chair. This is ridiculous. Come on, Victoria. We're leaving. Leaving won't change what you did, I called after them. And it won't change the fact that I'm moving into Grandma's house next week. I've already hired contractors to restore the porch you let rot for 3 years. Victoria spun around, her face twisted with fury. You can't prove we did anything wrong. That footage could show anything. It shows you and Mom in Grandma's study 4 days after the funeral, going through her desk. It shows Mom putting papers into her bag. It shows both of you looking directly at the camera and then Victoria covering it with a painting. I smiled again, this one genuine. The thing about Grandma is that she was smarter than either of you gave her credit for. She had backup cameras you didn't know about. The lie came easily, smooth as silk. There was no second camera, no damning footage beyond the first one that showed them in the study, which proved nothing concrete. But they didn't know that, and the fear in their eyes was worth every penny I'd spent on this elaborate revenge. Mom's hand trembled as she gripped the doorframe. If you had evidence of a crime, you'd have gone to the police, would I? And drag Dad through the mud, destroy what's left of this family publicly, spend years in litigation while lawyers bleed us all dry? I shook my head. No. This way is better. I get what Grandma wanted me to have, and you get to live with what you've done. Consider it a Christmas gift. They left without another word, the front door slamming hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Dad and I sat in silence for a long moment, the turkey getting cold between us. I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice cracking. I should have paid more attention. Should have protected you better. This isn't your fault. I reached across the table, squeezing his hand. You're a good man stuck in a bad situation. You always have been. He looked at me with watery eyes. What happens now? Now I move into the house I bought. You're welcome to visit anytime. I'm thinking of turning Grandma's sewing room into a proper design studio. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. And if you ever decide you want to leave Mom, you'll have a place to go. No questions asked. Dad nodded slowly, processing this information like he was learning a foreign language. The concept of leaving probably felt as alien to him as flying to Mars. We finished dinner in relative peace, though neither of us had much appetite. I helped him clean up, washing dishes in the same sink where Mom had once told me my art degree was equivalent to flushing money down the drain. Where Victoria had announced her engagement to a hedge fund manager while simultaneously reminding everyone I was still single at 29. The drive home to my apartment felt longer than usual, street lights blurring through light snow that had started to fall. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Victoria, each one more threatening than the last. I blocked her number after the 5th message about lawyers and fraud charges. Mom called twice. I let both go to voicemail. Aunt Paula was the only one I answered. I heard there was some excitement at dinner, she said, her voice carefully neutral. You could say that. Your mother called me, absolutely hysterical. Something about you stealing Dorothy's house through criminal means? Paula's tone suggested she didn't believe a word of it. I bought it fair and square. They put it on the market, I made an offer, they accepted. All very legal and above board. Paula laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Dorothy would be so proud of you. She always said you had more spine than the rest of them combined. My throat tightened. I found the letter you sent me. The one with Mr. Hammond's contact information. I don't know what you're talking about, Paula said, still laughing. I'm a terrible record keeper. Things just fall out of my files all the time. She'd known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to point me in the right direction, to give me the tools I needed without directly interfering. Thank you, I whispered. For what? I didn't do anything except be a forgetful old woman. She paused. But if I had done something, it would only be because Dorothy deserved better than what happened. And so did you. We talked for another hour, Paula sharing stories about Grandma that I'd never heard. How Dorothy had been a suffragette in her youth, how she'd scandalized the family by refusing 3 marriage proposals before finally accepting Grandpa's offer on her own terms. How she built a successful catering business in the 1960s when women weren't supposed to have careers. The house had been her crown jewel, purchased with her own money in 1975. Every Victorian detail had been chosen carefully, every piece of gingerbread trim a statement of independence. She'd raised my mother in that house, taught her that women could be anything they wanted. Somewhere along the way, Mom had twisted that lesson into believing she could take anything she wanted, consequences be damned. I spent Christmas night in my apartment, but I didn't feel alone. I pulled out the boxes of things I'd taken from Grandma's house during the estate sale, items Mom and Victoria had considered worthless. Costume jewelry, old photographs, recipe cards written in Grandma's spidery handwriting. There was a journal I'd never opened, bound in cracked leather with pages yellowed by time. I cracked it open carefully, and Grandma's voice flowed from the pages clearly as if she were sitting next to me. March 15, 2019. Updated my will today. Everything goes to Paula and Eleanor to split, except the house. The house goes to my granddaughter, the one who sees it as a home instead of an investment. The one who still visits even when she doesn't have to, who helps me in the garden and listens to my old stories. She has her grandmother's spirit, and she'll know what to do with it. I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. She'd known. Even before the cameras, before the theft, she'd known what kind of people her daughter and eldest granddaughter had become. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and planning. I hired a local contractor named Jake Martinez who'd grown up 3 houses down from Grandma's place. He remembered her lemonade and her stories about the house's history. "Your grandmother used to tell me this place had good bones," Jake said as we walked through the rooms, his clipboard filling with notes. She was right. Foundation solid, structures sound. Just need some love. We started with the porch, replacing rotted boards and restoring the intricate spindle work. The windows came next, original glass preserved where possible, matching replacements installed where necessary. I chose paint colors from old photographs, finding the exact shade of butter yellow Grandma had loved. Victoria tried to challenge the sale through her law firm. I received a threatening letter in January claiming fraud and undue influence. My attorney, Richard Chen, sent back a response so detailed and legally airtight that we never heard from them again. "They have no case," Richard explained during one of our meetings. "The sale was legitimate, the LLC was properly registered, and they were the ones who listed the property. The will situation is murkier, but since they already accepted payment for the house, they'd have to prove fraud to unwind the transaction. Based on what you've told me, they won't risk discovery." He was right. By February, the legal threats had stopped. Mom and Victoria retreated into wounded silence, playing the victims to anyone who would listen. I heard through mutual friends that they were telling people I'd manipulated them, that I'd exploited their grief. The whisper campaign had been predictable but still stung. Cousin Jennifer called me one evening, her voice tight with concern. "I just want to hear your side," she said, though her tone suggested she'd already made up her mind. "Your mom is really upset. She says you tricked them into selling below market value." I'd laughed at that, a sound with no humor in it. "Below market value? Jennifer, I paid $10,000 over asking. The listing was public, the sale was public. Anyone could have made an offer. But you knew how much it meant to them." "Did I?" "Because they sure never acted like it meant anything. They let the porch rot for 3 years. They sold Grandma's furniture at an estate sale for pennies on the dollar. They were going to bulldoze her garden to make the property more attractive to developers." My voice had risen despite my best efforts. "I bought a house that was for sale. That's not manipulation, that's capitalism." I thought Victoria would appreciate that. Jennifer had gone quiet for a moment. "She says you only did it for revenge." "Maybe I did. But I also did it because Grandma wanted me to have it, and they stole that from me. So yeah, call it revenge if you want. I call it justice." She'd hung up shortly after, and we hadn't spoken since. The family had split into camps, those who believed Mom and Victoria's version of events, and those who quietly supported me. Aunt Paula was firmly in my corner, of course. A few cousins who'd always been closer to me than to Victoria sent supportive texts but were careful not to make their allegiance too public. Dad's presence in my corner had been the real shock to the system. When he'd moved into the guest room, the family gossip mill had gone into overdrive. Mom was telling everyone he'd had a breakdown, that I'd brainwashed him. Victoria claimed he was senile, unable to make sound decisions. The reality was far simpler and more damning. He'd finally seen them clearly, and he hadn't liked what he'd seen. I found some old home videos, he told me one night in late March, sitting at the kitchen table we'd refinished together. From when you and Victoria were little. I was watching them, trying to figure out when everything went wrong. He pulled out his laptop, showing me grainy footage from the early 1990s. 2 little girls playing in a backyard, Mom pushing us on swings. We looked happy, normal. Just a regular family having a regular day. I kept watching, Dad continued, clicking through to another video. "This one's from your 8th birthday party." The footage showed a modest celebration, balloon animals and a grocery store cake. Young me was beaming, showing off a paint set someone had given me. And there was Mom, in the background, looking at her watch. Checking the time at her own daughter's birthday party. "She was waiting for something," I said softly, seeing it clearly even across the years. "Her real estate exam results. They were supposed to be posted that afternoon." Dad's voice was hollow. "I remember now. She kept disappearing to check the computer. She was happier when she passed the exam than she was about your birthday." He'd showed me more videos, and the pattern was undeniable. Every milestone of mine was marred by Mom's distraction, her impatience, her barely concealed desire to be somewhere else. But the videos of Victoria told a different story, Mom's full attention, her genuine smiles, her pride radiating from every frame. "I didn't see it then," Dad said. "Or maybe I didn't want to see it. It was easier to pretend everything was fine, that I was imagining the differences. You were surviving, I told him. That's all any of us can do sometimes. The divorce proceedings had been brutal. Mom had hired an aggressive attorney who tried to paint Dad as unstable, claiming I'd manipulated him into abandoning his family. They demanded he undergo psychological evaluation, suggested he was having an affair with someone younger. Anything to avoid admitting the simple truth, he'd left because staying was slowly killing him. Dad's attorney, a bulldog of a woman named Patricia Hunt, had shut down every attack with ruthless efficiency. She presented evidence of emotional abuse, financial control, years of documented belittling and manipulation. She'd interviewed me, Aunt Paula, even some of Dad's co-workers who'd witnessed Mom's behavior over the years. Your mother, Patricia had told me during a deposition break, is a piece of work. I've been practicing family law for 23 years, and I've seen my share of narcissists. She's textbook. The legal process had dragged on. Dad had started the paperwork in March, spent weeks gathering documentation and evidence, consulted with Patricia extensively about strategy. By the time everything was ready and he'd worked up the courage to actually file, it was early June. 3 days after the filing, he'd moved into my guest room permanently, unable to stay under the same roof with Mom any longer. The settlement had been fair, splitting assets down the middle despite Mom's attempts to claim she deserved more. Dad had walked away with his retirement account, half the value of their house, and his freedom. He'd claimed it was the best deal of his life. Let them talk. I had the house. Dad started visiting in March, showing up on Saturday mornings with coffee and donuts. We'd sit on the newly restored porch, watching the neighborhood wake up, and he'd tell me stories about my childhood I'd never heard before. Your mother wasn't always like this, he said one morning, staring into his coffee cup. When we first met, she was different. Ambitious, yes, but not cruel. I'm not sure when it changed. Does it matter? I asked gently. People change. Sometimes they become better versions of themselves, sometimes worse. All we can control is how we respond. He nodded slowly. I've been thinking about what you said. About having a place to go. My heart jumped, but I kept my voice neutral. The offer stands. No pressure, no timeline. Just know that you're always welcome. I talked to a lawyer. Started the divorce paperwork last week, he said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. Haven't filed yet, but I have everything ready. I reached over and hugged him, feeling how small he'd become. When had my father started seeming so fragile? I'm proud of you, I whispered. I should have done it years ago. Should have stood up for you more, protected you from her criticism. His voice broke. I'm sorry I was such a coward. You did the best you could with what you had. That's all anyone can do. We sat together until our coffee got cold, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a family again. Not the family I was born into, but the one I was building piece by piece, like restoring this old house. The garden came back to life in April. I hired a landscaper who specialized in historical restoration, and together we recreated Grandma's rose garden from old photographs. Pink and yellow blooms, the same variety she'd tended for 40 years. Jake and his crew finished the interior work in May. Original hardwood floors refinished, plaster walls repaired, the old radiators cleaned and serviced. I moved in on a Saturday, carrying boxes up the same stairs I'd climbed as a child. Aunt Paula came by with champagne and Chinese takeout. To Dorothy, she said, raising her glass in the empty living room. Who always knew how to play the long game. To Grandma, I echoed, and we drank. Dad moved into the guest room in June, 3 days after he finally filed for divorce. Mom was apparently shocked, unable to understand why he'd throw away 35 years of marriage. Victoria called him a traitor and stopped speaking to him entirely. He seemed lighter without them, younger somehow. He started taking photography classes at the community center, something he'd always wanted to do but never had time for. His photos of the house and garden started appearing on the walls, mixed with Grandma's old paintings and my own design work. We created something new in that old house. A home built on honesty instead of obligation, respect instead of manipulation. I ran into Mom at the grocery store in August. She looked older, harder, her makeup not quite covering the circles under her eyes. We stared at each other across the produce section, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. She turned away instead, pushing her cart toward the checkout. I let her go. There was nothing left to say. Victoria sent a wedding invitation in September. I wasn't invited to be in the wedding party, barely made the guest list at all based on the tier of invitation. I sent a polite decline and a generous check, because Grandma had taught me that being right didn't require being cruel. The house project was finally complete by October. Every room restored, every detail perfected. I threw an open house party, inviting the neighbors who remembered Grandma, the contractors who'd helped rebuild, the friends who'd supported me through everything. Dad took photos while Aunt Paula told stories. Jake brought his family, his kids running through the rooms where he'd once played as a boy. The house filled with laughter and music, exactly as Grandma would have wanted. I stood on the porch as the sun set, watching the last guests leave, and I felt Grandma's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside me. The house had been her legacy, her statement that she'd built something lasting. Now it was mine to protect and nurture. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. You won. Are you happy now? Victoria. Still playing the victim, still unable to understand that this was never about winning. I typed back carefully, this was never a game. It was always about honoring someone who deserved better. I hope someday you understand the difference. I blocked the number before she could respond. The house settled around me as night fell, old wood creaking in familiar ways. I'd spent $285,000 to buy what should have been freely given. I'd burned bridges with my mother and sister that would probably never be rebuilt. I'd exposed family secrets and forced my father to choose between comfort and integrity. And I'd do it all again without hesitation. The months that followed had brought unexpected challenges and equally unexpected joys. The house had revealed its secrets slowly, like a mystery novel where each chapter added depth to the story. I'd found letters Grandma had written but never sent, tucked behind loose boards and hidden in the backs of drawers. One letter, addressed to Mom but dated just weeks before Grandma's death, had made me cry for hours. In her elegant script, Grandma had pleaded with her daughter to be kinder to me, to see the value in my choices and talents. She'd reminded Mom of her own struggles to be recognized, her own battles against people who'd underestimated her. You of all people should know how it feels, Grandma had written. You fought so hard to be more than what your father expected. Why would you deny your own daughter the same grace you demanded for yourself? She is brilliant and creative and kind, everything I hoped you'd teach her to be. But instead, you've tried to make her into something she's not, and in doing so, you're breaking something precious. The letter had never been sent. Maybe Grandma had known it would fall on deaf ears, or maybe she chickened out at the last moment. Either way, it existed now as evidence of what I'd always suspected. Grandma had seen everything, understood everything, and loved me despite how her own daughter had failed. I'd also found financial records that told another story. Grandma had been quietly funding my college education, sending money to cover what my scholarships didn't. I thought I was getting lucky with grants and work-study positions, never knowing that the anonymous donor who'd paid my housing costs was actually my grandmother. She'd paid for my first car, too, the Honda I still drove. The dealership had told me I'd qualified for special financing, first-time buyer assistance. Lies, all of it. Grandma had paid cash, then arranged for me to make token monthly payments so I wouldn't feel like I was accepting charity. Discovering these things had been overwhelming. She'd protected me, supported me, believed in me, all while maintaining the fiction that I was making it on my own. She'd known I needed to believe in my own strength, even as she quietly ensured I had the resources to succeed. Between the house purchase and the renovation budget I'd carefully planned, my finances were tight but manageable. The remaining $45,000 from my equity sale, combined with the healthy income I was still earning from ongoing freelance contracts, meant I could afford the restoration work if I was smart about it. I prioritized structural issues first, then cosmetic improvements, spreading the costs over 8 months instead of trying to do everything at once. Jake had given me a fair price and a payment plan that worked with my cash flow. The community had welcomed me back with open arms once word spread that I'd bought the house. Mrs. Chen from next door had brought over casseroles and stories about Grandma. The Martinelli family 2 houses down had helped me move furniture. Even Mr. Russo, the grumpy widower across the street, had stopped by with advice about the plumbing. Your grandma was good people, he'd said, his Brooklyn accent thick despite 40 years in our small Midwestern town. She helped my wife during her cancer treatment, brought meals, drove her to appointments. Never asked for nothing in return. This house deserves someone who'll love it like she did. I joined the neighborhood association, attended community meetings, became part of the fabric of Maple Street in ways I never could have while living in my sterile apartment across town. These people remembered Grandma's kindness, her generosity, her fierce protection of her neighbors. They expected the same from me, and I was determined not to disappoint. Jake's crew had become like family during the renovation. I'd learned about his daughter's soccer games, his son's struggles with algebra, his wife's dream of opening a bakery. When the porch project finished, I'd surprised them with a bonus and a handwritten thank you note that Jake said he'd framed. Most clients just want the work done cheap and fast, he told me, shaking my hand on the final day. You cared about doing it right, preserving the history. That's rare. The relationships I built through this process had become more valuable than I could have anticipated. My freelance business had grown through word-of-mouth referrals from neighbors and contractors. I designed logos for Jake's company and 3 other local businesses. Mrs. Chen's son had hired me to brand his startup. Success built on genuine connections rather than Mom's transactional networking had felt different, cleaner. These people valued my work because they valued me, not because they saw me as a means to an end. I'd also started teaching design classes at the community center, using Grandma's old sewing room as a studio. Teenagers who'd been told they weren't good enough, creative enough, focused enough, they came to me and I saw myself in every single one. I taught them software and theory, but more importantly, I taught them that their voices mattered. One girl, Ashley, had shown particular promise. She reminded me of myself at 16, full of ideas and passion but surrounded by people who couldn't see it. Her parents wanted her to study business, something practical. She wanted to design album covers for bands. My mom says art is a hobby, not a career, she confided during one class, her portfolio spread out between us. The work was raw but talented, exactly the kind of distinctive style that could break through in the right market. Your mom is wrong, I'd said bluntly. Art can be whatever you make it. I make more than most lawyers I know, and I work from home in my pajamas half the time. But more than that, I love what I do. Can your mom say that about her job? Ashley had gotten into a prestigious design program with a full scholarship. Her mother had called me, furious, accusing me of encouraging her daughter to throw her life away. I'd listened politely, then hung up. Some people would never understand, and that wasn't my problem to solve. The house had become a hub for creativity and connection in ways that would have made Grandma proud. I hosted dinners for local artists, providing space for them to network and collaborate. The living room that had once hosted Grandma's bridge club now saw painters and musicians, writers and photographers, all feeding off each other's energy. Dad had flourished in this environment. His photography was improving rapidly, and he'd started submitting to local galleries. One of his shots, a close-up of morning dew on Grandma's roses, had sold for $500 at a charity auction. He'd cried when he got the check, overwhelmed by the validation. I spent 35 years believing I was only good for one thing, he'd said, staring at the check like it might disappear. Going to work, bringing home money, staying out of the way. Your mother made me think that was all I had to offer. You're so much more than that, I'd assured him. You always were. She just couldn't see it because it didn't benefit her. Watching him discover himself at 62 had been bittersweet. So much time wasted, so many years lost to someone else's narrow vision of who he should be. But he was free now, and that mattered more than the regret. Because this house represented more than property or money. It was proof that some things were worth fighting for, that the long game was sometimes the only game worth playing. It was Grandma's final lesson, taught from beyond the grave: stand up for what's yours, protect what matters, and never let anyone make you smaller than you are. I locked the front door and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, the one that had been mine every summer of my childhood. Tomorrow I'd start working on Grandma's recipes, trying to recreate her lemon cookies from the stained index cards I'd saved. I'd water the roses and photograph the morning light filtering through the restored windows. I'd live the life Grandma had wanted for this house, filled with creativity and joy and stubborn independence. The title deed sat framed on my office wall, next to Grandma's portrait. My name in black ink, proof of ownership that no one could dispute or steal. Mom had been right about one thing at that Christmas dinner: I was never in the official will. But she'd been wrong about everything else. I didn't waste the house. I saved it. And in doing so, I saved myself.